And we have liftoff. Welcome to the Amnesty International Belfast Pride Lecture for 2020. I'm William Crawley, and I'm delighted to be here again chairing the International Lecture. And as you can see, we're all remote this year. There's a pandemic on, but it's really important that we continue to have these lectures because there are other pandemics of injustice that continue in the world. So settle in with us for an evening of conversation, of talk and thinking together. And if you can join us in the conversation, we'd love that too. People are joining us all around the world on Twitter, on Facebook and on YouTube. There's closed captioning available on YouTube as well. So without any further ado, to introduce this year's Amnesty International Belfast Pride Lecturer, welcome Patrick Corrigan, the Northern Ireland Director for Amnesty International.
Thank you, William, and happy Belfast Pride, everybody. A big shout out to everybody wherever you are. Of course, we wish we were with you there in person as we are every other year, but this is the next best thing, and we're with you live from our respective homes around the country and around the world, as you'll find out from Sen in a moment, who's speaking to us from Sydney. It has been quite a phenomenal year for LGBT rights campaigning here in Northern Ireland. It's the year that we won the battle for marriage equality, and we saw the first couples walk down the aisle, and further changes are happening there over the coming months, and we continue to keep a close eye on that. And just in the last few weeks, we have seen a new campaign pick up huge momentum to ban conversion therapy, joining a campaign elsewhere in the UK to get it abolished here in Northern Ireland too. So there's so much activism going on, COVID or no COVID. We can change the world from our homes and online and all the different ways in which we connect. And that's really the theme of tonight's lecture. And we're delighted to have somebody brilliantly placed to talk to us about being unapologetically fabulous and fighting to thrive during a global crisis. Dr. Sen Raj is not just an academic, and he is a great academic. He's a lecturer in law at Keele University. He just has a book just published called Feeling Queer Jurisprudence, but he's also an activist, and among other hats that he wears, he's a board member for Amnesty International UK and helps to steer our work in this country and around the world. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to a brilliant mind, a brilliant speaker, a brilliant activist, somebody we simply know as Sen, formerly Dr. Sen Raj, speaking to you tonight on being unapologetically fabulous, fighting to thrive during a global crisis. Sen, take it away.
Good evening, everyone. It is a pleasure to be joining you. And as Patrick mentioned, I'm actually joining you from my parents' lounge room here in Sydney. So it's quite early in the morning, but you know, I've kind of zhuzhed up myself, so feeling quite fresh. And my mother baked a lovely pink cake for me earlier, so I've got a bit of sugar going through me. So hopefully this will keep me going for the lecture today. So without further ado, I will begin. Fabulous. It's a word that packs a lot of punch. Most of us aspire in one way or the other to be gifted with this compliment. You know, you're fabulous. I know I do. But what exactly does it mean to be fabulous? In their wonderful book, Fabulous, performance artist Madison Moore describes fabulousness as a theory of political glitter. Fabulousness is more than aesthetic or a compliment. It's a political practice rooted in the lives of queer and trans people of colour who dare to sparkle in a world that tries to dull their existences. Fabulousness, then, isn't just about bathing in glitter, as you can see, displaying rainbows and dressing in sequins. It's a process where social outcasts work to transform themselves into a spectacle, to unapologetically claim space. We do fabulousness from scenes of cultural marginalisation, economic deprivation and trauma. It isn't easy. Being fabulous means navigating vulnerability, love, beauty, pain, joy and creativity simultaneously when your life is in perpetual crisis. In my lecture today, I borrow from Moore's moving articulation of fabulousness as a kind of glitter politics to talk about how we, as people fighting for justice and human rights, can aspire to make space in the world to be fabulous. In doing so, we can create a world to thrive with love, safety, solidarity, freedom, recognition, justice, and community. So let me begin then with that special moment heralded as the birth of pride, Stonewall. In the early hours of Saturday, 28th of June, 1969, the New York Police Department raided the Stonewall Inn in an attempt to permanently close a bar that served alcohol to homosexuals, which violated licensing regulations at the time. Police raids on Stonewall and other gay bars were routine at the time, but on this particular night, local patrons refused to disperse or allow their friends to be arrested. These queers or street hustlers, such as drag queens, sex workers, trans women, gay men, lesbians, who came from various parts of the city to hang out at that bar, sung, threw objects, and used their bodies to resist the police invasion. The protest gathered momentum and continued throughout the week. Much is written about the various people involved, such as Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, Stormy DeLavery, and Mark Siegel. These accounts differ, sometimes wildly, in relation to the impetus, role, scale, and nature of each person involved. But Stonewall doesn't have a single hero, and it's the disparate accounts of people coming together as part of the rebellion that gives Stonewall its enduring legacy. Stonewall is less a single event in gay history and more a constellation of queer expectations and experiences. This constellation captures the rage, pain, joy, and hope of queer people, both then and now, fighting to exist in a world that negates atypical pleasures, intimacies, and identities. In other words, Stonewall, as a movement led largely by Black trans women and lesbians, has come to represent the fabulousness of people coming together, often with the most to lose, to defend their communities against violent policing and moral persecution. Many were poor, many were homeless, many were hurt, many were risking greater abuse, but they were still refusing to compromise who they were or who they loved. This is why our existence, our pride, is political. Stonewall was a riot that sought to radically transform political institutions that prize the heterosexual family and patriarchal kinship. Connected to related movements like women's liberation and Black power, many of the people who rioted at Stonewall campaigned not just to end the sodomy laws — of course, gay sex was illegal in every US state except Illinois at the time in 1969 — but also to end military interventions and police brutality. These political aspirations to end state violence aren't consigned to some radical past. Campaigns like Black Lives Matter, for example, have exposed the continuing ways in which Black people face disproportionate levels of policing, incarceration, and death. Started by queer women Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, and Patrisse Cullors in 2013, the Black Lives Matter movement began as an online response to the murder of Trayvon Martin in Florida and his killer's subsequent acquittal. Black Lives Matter has recently gained enormous global attention following the killing of George Floyd by a police officer. This prompted global protests about racist policing specifically and the need for social transformation more broadly. As Alicia Garza said in an interview with National Geographic a few weeks ago, "In the midst of all the grief and rage and pain, there's a hopefulness. There is a longing for who we can be together. This movement crosses so many others, which shows that we can build new kinds of communities where everyone can belong, and where everyone can be valued, and where everyone can be powerful." For Garza, Black Lives Matter isn't a movement about one person or one identity or one issue. Much like Stonewall, a movement to defend Black lives is necessarily tied to movements aimed at ensuring reproductive health care, migrant safety, safe housing, and quality education, just to name a few. As the famous Black lesbian poet Audre Lorde once said, "There is no such thing as a single-issue struggle because we do not live single-issue lives." Black feminist activists like Gaza and Lorde point to the problem with limiting political aspirations to one axis of identity. People aren't just LGBTIQ. People aren't just Black. People aren't just migrants. You can't claim to be fighting for LGBTIQ rights if you ignore the fact that LGBTIQ people who seek asylum are being turned away at the border or sent back to places criminalizing homosexuality. Stonewall and Black Lives Matter resonate as movements showcasing how our freedoms are intersectional and indivisible. However, activism isn't just about embracing what can at times feel like an academic way of describing the world. It isn't enough to share a meme about intersectionality, change your profile to a black fist, or add a hashtag to the end of your name for one day to memorialize someone who has been brutally murdered by police. These are nice gestures, of course, but activism is difficult work, often involving personal and political risks. Last month, we witnessed thousands of people in places like London and New York take to the streets to march for Black trans lives while having to confront police at these protests. Tony McDade, Nina Pop, Rhea Milton, Dominique Remy Fells are the names of a few Black trans people killed in the last few months. Saying their names is an important act of memorialization. There are many more to learn, name, and honor. But it isn't enough to mourn Black trans lives or care about them when people die. We need to make spaces for them to flourish and be fabulous when they're alive. The Black Trans Lives Matter protests aim to highlight the ways in which racism, misogyny, homophobia, and transphobia consign Black trans women, in particular, to precarity and poverty. Yet, they also made clear how trans communities of color continue to nourish each other by providing mutual aid, creating ballroom houses, and even gossiping together. If you need a decent pop culture reference to get a better sense of what I'm talking about right now, I would recommend the series Pose and the documentary Disclosure on Netflix. While Black trans people face enormous violence, they aren't defined by their trauma or their oppression. Alleviating the kinds of inequalities captured by the Black Trans Lives Matter movement requires us to disrupt existing political systems and reimagine our ways of living together. Law reform and legal recognition aren't enough. Black trans people face enormous challenges in accessing appropriate and gender-sensitive healthcare. They are abused by police in public and killed by abusive partners in private. In death, they are often referred to by a name and gender that don't align with who they are. The continuum of violence against Black trans people, and trans people more broadly, isn't confined to visible acts of physical violence that we witness in homes or streets. We see it emerge in laws that criminalize sex work or what is called public debauchery. We see it materialize in print or online media every day, as newspaper after newspaper treats the identities of trans people as debatable, trivializes the validity of being non-binary, casts trans people as potential predators, and treats trans children as confused and sick. Resisting these attempts to deny and degrade the existence of trans people, demonstrating unapologetic solidarity in the face of enormous political and media pressure, is key to making space for such people to flourish. This was beautifully and simply demonstrated recently by the hashtag #WhyI'mATransAlly, though, of course, being an ally demands much more than a sincere tweet. This now brings me to saying a few words about the importance of solidarity as a condition of not simply surviving, but thriving in a world that negates your existence. We suffer differently because of who we are. We have differences in how we define our sexuality, understand our sex or gender, and how we pursue relationships and families. We don't always understand each other's differences, but we can respect each other's rights to live without systemic abuse. Solidarity doesn't mean we ignore or cover over those differences in order to present a harmonious front. Yet we can still come together as a community to resist political and social attempts to police who we are or who we love. Moral persecution affects us all. Solidarity means thinking about the space we occupy in the world and being willing to address the fact that how we occupy that space might impede the lives of others or exclude them. I remember when I was giving a talk to a group of gay lawyers earlier this month, sat here, in my lounge room, and I was accused of being indoctrinated because I'm both gay and Hindu. I was told that being religious was a vestige of internalized homophobia. I initially brushed it off with awkward laughter, and after the talk, reflected on my discomfort at hearing this statement. Of course, politicians have weaponized religion to perpetuate horrific violence and vilification of LGBTIQ people. Yet for many of us, our faith has also been a way to sustain and nourish our queerness. As tempting as it might be to insist, you can't be religious and gay. Such politics can mean that queer people of faith are less likely to find belonging in spaces that are meant to welcome them. It also makes it easier for religious bodies to exclude us by saying, wrongly, that our sexuality makes us incompatible. Solidarity is also not a self-congratulatory exercise or one to show off your charitable compassion. As LGBTIQ activists, we're drawn to the plight of those who face abuse elsewhere. This is important. After all, about 70 countries still criminalize gay sex, and many more have laws targeting the so-called promotion of homosexuality. But when we fight against the criminalization of homosexuality in Uganda, or fight the purge of gay and lesbian people in Chechnya, we need to do so in a way that recognizes our colonial legacies and refuses to see ourselves as their saviors. Feeling good is fine, but when we center our emotional sensibilities at the expense of those we claim to care about, we often make activism less about creating a better world and more about making ourselves feel better about the world. So creating space for others to thrive means becoming a little more humble, self-reflective, and uncomfortable. We need to be open to accountability and critique without feeling attacked by either. So where does that leave us now in the pandemic? Well, COVID-19 has exposed the disproportionate ways in which political measures in the name of public health can harm those of us who are LGBTIQ, especially if you're from a Black or ethnic minority background. In Uganda, authorities raided a shelter housing homeless LGBT people and beat a number of them under the pretext that they were violating public health orders. In South Korea, some media vilified gay bars as sites enabling the spread of COVID-19. In Hungary and Poland, the government has cited quote-unquote gender ideology and used the expanding reach of government power to block the legal recognition of trans and intersex people and create so-called LGBT-free zones. In the US, the government issued directives that would allow religious-affiliated healthcare providers to deny medical treatment to LGBT people. In the UK, despite promises made years ago, trans people lack a simple process to change their legal gender marker. Intersex infants endure non-consensual medical and surgical procedures to quote-unquote fix their bodies. The rise of discrimination against LGBTIQ people in the context of this pandemic isn't new. Just look at past and present responses to HIV. But as our communities organized against a virus that killed and still kills our friends, families, and lovers, we can find hope in the ways our communities challenge stigma, which leads to internalized shame and social regulations. Because of course, who we are and who we love should never be a source of shame. The fight for marriage equality in Northern Ireland is also a powerful example of this. The Love Equality Coalition brought together disparate groups of people from different sectors to campaign for equal relationship recognition. Yet that campaign also showed that we are organising for much more than law reform. We're organising to create spaces for LGBTIQ people to feel like they have space in the world to exist. Gavin Boyd from the Rainbow Project in Northern Ireland told the BBC in June, "In just the last 3 weeks, we know 3 LGBT people who have ended their lives." The issue of suicide is complex and is one that requires sensitive discussion. Creating the conditions for livability means making room for everyone, especially young people, to express their sexuality and gender in unexpected ways. As the late journalist Lyra McKee reminds us in a letter to her younger self, "Keep hanging on, kid. It's worth it. I love you." Loving ourselves and each other is still a political act when our bodies and relationships are treated as sick or sinful. Creating the space for us to belong means creating homes, workplaces, schools, temples, and playgrounds that don't simply tolerate differences, but nourish them. I want to conclude my talk with the words of Angela Davis, a Black lesbian abolitionist who has been campaigning for social justice from the time of Stonewall through to today. In an interview with The Guardian, Davis stated, "The most important thing from where I stand is to begin to give expression to ideas about what we can do next. We might not have perfected all our ideas yet about where to go next, but our communities are already imagining fabulous new ways to live and thrive in the world. We could thrive in a world without violent policing. We could thrive in a world without suffocating social norms. We could thrive in a world without militarized borders. There is no one way to be fabulous, of course, but we have a responsibility to make space for everyone to express their fabulousness." And with that, I say, happy Pride and stay fabulous.
Sen, thank you very much. Really appreciate that. And we're already getting questions and comments on Facebook and other ways you're getting in touch with us, which is terrific. I'll bring some of those into our conversation we have now. Do you ever encounter people in the LGBTQ world or community, Sen, who want the glitter without the politics?
Yes, I think that's quite a common feature. You know, when I was at university, there was a kind of social group that was created for LGBTIQ people, and it was designed with the explicit intent of quote unquote not being political. And, you know, there's a lot to be said about that. You know, we shouldn't always have to see ourselves as being political, as being activists. You know, we should have spaces where we can have fun and enjoy ourselves and, you know, just relax. But at the same time, we can't forget that we do live in a world, unfortunately, where many of us are suffering violence and discrimination. And, you know, while some of us may enjoy great freedom and protection and have the luxury to party and go to clubs all night, there are other people who don't even have the ability to come out. And we do need to recognize that. And we still need to fight to make sure that they also have the kind of space that we enjoy.
I'm conscious, you mentioned Stonewall. I'm conscious when you read the histories of that period, a lot of people kind of look back on that period as if it was just one thing. It was a very complex thing. And there were people in the LGBT community, as we would use that term now today, who were very resistant to what happened at Stonewall, didn't like rioting, didn't like the protests, wanted people to keep their heads down.
Yeah, I mean, I think we also need to remember that there are very different ways of organizing. You know, rebellions and riots, of course, are so important. But there's also a lot of organizing that happens, you know, behind the scenes, that happens in parliaments, that happens in, you know, institutional walls, if you like, you know, organizing that might take place in a courtroom, or organizing that might take place in a school, in a church, you know, things you don't always see, that aren't always visible, but they're always important as well. I do think, though, we need to be careful about moralizing that, you know, one form of organizing is better than another. They're all important. They all play a role, and we need to be able to acknowledge the different ways in which people have historically and in the present come together to change the world.
Here's a question for you from one of our friends on Facebook. Can you talk a little bit more about how celebrating perceived defiance and or fabulousness works out? What are the dynamics of that? And give us some examples.
Well, I think pride is just is an example in itself of what it means to celebrate defiance. Even though there's lots of criticisms made about how corporate pride has become lately, you see people organizing their floats. You see people from children marching with their gay dads or their lesbian mothers, through to people celebrating their fetishes, their kinks, marching in leather, which the fact that we can get all these different kind of spaces and people coming together in this one space shows that you can celebrate fabulousness, and it's not always easy, of course. And I think it's really important to emphasize that fabulousness isn't just simply putting on a beautiful dress and have someone say to you, oh, you look great. Fabulousness is work, and it's often difficult. And I think when you look to the history of people saying, oh, we're so fabulous, you'll find that it's hard work for what they've had to do. They've had to deal with conflict and difficulty, and we as a community also have differences and difficulties. And I think as great as it is that we can say that we're fabulous, we also need to acknowledge that we do need to have conversations about how we relate to one another, and sometimes that can be quite difficult.
You talked about solidarity, Sen. I suppose a contrast might be silos, where people hang out with people and with issues that they're particularly comfortable with, rather than allowing that to roll out to a much bigger world. I was watching John Lewis's memorial service today in the United States, and those who knew John Lewis, Congressman Lewis, very well, indeed Martin Luther King well as well, said he wasn't just a one-issue politician or activist. It was, black rights and black justice was very important, but social and economic justice was also part of the story with Martin Luther King and with John Lewis. And I just wonder, when you look at queer politics or LGBT conversations these days, do you sense that there is a sort of silo mentality? Let's just deal with that. Let's just deal with that one thing and not deal with the other stuff.
Yeah, I think it depends on where you're at in the community. I always say that there are many LGBTI communities out there. I belong to a wonderful group in Manchester where I'm normally resident called Rainbow Noir. And they're a group of LGBTIQ people of color who come together. And, the conversations that we often have deal with issues around migration. There are people in our group who are seeking asylum, where we talk about racism, we talk about economic justice, we talk about housing. Because, of course, our lives aren't just simply, oh, we're gay and nothing else. And I don't think anyone can say that their life is just one aspect of their identity, right? And so, unfortunately, we do see often in a lot of public conversations and debates that, gay rights is a synonym for LGBTIQ rights. And also, when you even talk about gay rights, it's basically marriage equality, and that's it, as if, that's the last key achievement, and once we have that, everything will be fine. And we know that that's not true. And I think, a lot of people are having these conversations, and we see with Black Lives Matter, while it has been focused on, the policing of Black people in the United States, it's also drawing attention to much broader issues like housing, safety, economic justice. And it was started, and I think it's really important to emphasize, by 3 queer Black women, who were talking about issues of gender and sexual justice while they were campaigning for Black lives.
You've also emphasized in building solidarity the need, and I wrote it down, your actual words, the need to develop accountability and critique. Is there actually space for accountability and critique, though? Because we are in such a partisan, siloed world these days in all of our politics. You've got one part of the community perhaps using language like woke this and cancel culture that, and others using equally disparaging language on the other side of the debate. Where is the meeting? Where is the space for accountability and critique?
I think, unfortunately, a lot of these debates become a bit caricatured, as if, there are these 2 opposing sides. And I think it's far richer than that. And, when you have conversations with people, you realize that there's a lot more depth to what we often see on Twitter or social media more broadly, actually. I think, when it comes to these conversations about cancel culture, they miss something fundamentally, which is that, pointing out that, what someone said is racist or homophobic isn't designed to say that they're worthless as a human being, or that, they should ever participate in any conversation. It's to actually encourage them to learn. I often talk about this in the context of love. If you love someone, you don't just support everything they do unconditionally, because, when they do something wrong or say something wrong, you want them to learn from it. You want them to, acknowledge a mistake and, grow from that, because that's actually part of how we build communities. And so there's nothing wrong with making mistakes. The point is that you're open and willing to, let people identify that, reflect on that yourself, and hopefully learn. And I think we can have a lot better conversations and build stronger communities if we started opening up a little bit more and being a bit more vulnerable and being a little less defensive all the time.
Is there too much defensive-ness within the LGBTQI community?
I think, for example, not specifically within any one particular community. I think it's more that, as soon as these days, it seems that people are more offended by being called racist or homophobic than actual racism and homophobia. So, when someone points out something you've done is racist or homophobic, your immediate response shouldn't be trying to defend immediately why your intentions were good or you didn't mean it that way, but actually listen and say, well, actually, I can see why that's the case, and then just move on. I think unfortunately people become really intransigent and kind of locked down into these positions as if they're being personally vilified, and then it just doesn't really allow for any conversation to happen.
We often hear people these days in the Black Lives Matter debate saying, well, all lives matter. And I suppose the equivalent of that in terms of pride culture would be to say, why LGBT pride, why gay pride, why not straight pride, why not everybody's pride? Does pride make sense anymore?
Of course it does. I mean, we live in a world, as I mentioned before, where about 70 countries still criminalize gay sex, and a number of countries have laws that prohibit the quote-unquote promotion of homosexuality. Trans people are still being killed and denied basic legal recognition. The list of examples continues. And as long as we live in a world where people are marginalized on the basis of their sexual orientation, gender identity, race and ethnicity, and so on, we of course need to have these sorts of campaigns and spaces to point out that their lives do matter, because unfortunately society still doesn't treat them as of equal worth.
Is the fabulous glitter politics you're describing, is it always left-wing? Can you be of the right and be involved in glitter politics?
Look, I think it's a difficult question, because I don't normally frame it in those partisan terms. I suppose, when we do, that kind of spectrum doesn't really necessarily align very well to this kind of politics. I think, a lot of people on the left and the right might see themselves as caring about communities, about rights, about justice. It's a question of how you think about that might be different. But this politics that I guess I'm talking about moves away from the political partisan nature of how we have these conversations to actually start thinking about, well, where do people come from? What are their backgrounds? How does trauma function? What does institutionalized racism and violence and discrimination look like? And actually having the tools and the ability to be critical and empathetic. I think for a lot of people, we can start having kind of better conversations and better politics effectively if we start being a little bit more self-reflective and a little more humble, I think, when we start having dialogues.
Lots of questions coming in on Facebook, on the Amnesty International UK Facebook page, and also the Amnesty International NI page. I'll bring some of those to you now. Some advice, this question asks, some advice, please, for those who want to be LGBTQI allies.
Yeah, look, I mean, there's so much that's been written out there. And my first advice is always Google. There's a lot, follow people on Twitter. There are some really amazing people out there doing a lot of public education work for free. And that's a real starting point, because often it can be really hard when you talk to your gay friend or your trans lover and expect them to explain to you their issues and difficulties in life. It can be very emotionally draining. So sometimes it's better if just read about that, engage yourself, and just support people. If someone comes up to you and says, oh, would you mind helping me with this? Or I've had this issue. Don't immediately try and justify the alternative position or say what they're feeling or trivialize what they're feeling. Just give them the space to share it. And, these very basic interpersonal things you can do can be enormously meaningful. And of course, start supporting organizations and groups and, funding them and giving your time to them, because that can really make a huge difference as well. And I have to make a plug here for the Amnesty UK Rainbow Network as a really good place to do that.
How can schools, I'm reading this question, how can schools take a more active role in educating?
Look, I think one of the encouraging things is that we know that, England and Wales, for example, has introduced a new sex and relationships education curriculum, that has been obviously met with a lot of controversy. But, we need to start having these conversations quite young. People often say, oh, we shouldn't be sexualizing children or indoctrinating them into LGBT issues or rights. And all I say to them is, as a gay kid, I grew up hearing about heterosexual lifestyles my entire life. I saw it on the street. I read about it in the books, all the fairy tales and so on and so forth. And yet here I am, a proud gay man. And I think the important thing is that, education can start age appropriate from a very young age, just around diversity and difference. And, we need to create spaces, as I said, to nourish people's differences without trying to say that they're being, ideological or propagandizing simply for existing.
Sen, what's been the most frustrating aspect of queer activism for you?
Personally, it's been this kind of polarization that we often see that, people either say, well, you either support LGBTIQ rights or you support the rights of migrants, or you can't be gay and you can't be religious. And often these kind of fracturing debates are really hurtful because so many of us have multiple identities. And unfortunately, in the LGBTI spaces that I've been, I've seen and encountered it a number of times where people often say, well, no, you can't be religious and gay, or they say, oh, Muslims hate gays. And, I have family who are Muslim and they are enormously supporting and encouraging of me and what I do for a living, as you can see. And so, it pains me when we see sometimes racism used as a sort of a weapon against homophobia and vice versa, of course. And I think we really need to move past those kinds of debates, both within our community and beyond.
Someone's asking this question again about pride. A lot of people are asking this question about pride and whether it has really outlasted its usefulness in terms of the commercialization, in terms of what it means to people around pride.
Yeah, look, all I have to say to that is one of the things I loved when I moved to the UK was the fact that there were hundreds of Pride events and festivals that were happening across 6 months. And so obviously you have your big prides like Pride in London and Manchester Pride and so on. But I'm talking about the Stoke-on-Trent Pride. I'm talking about the Didsbury Pride. I'm talking about these little community prides that are organized by local LGBTI people in their local communities and actually aren't very commercial at all. And to me, that's amazing. And I really enjoy those spaces. So I think sometimes we think of Pride and we only think of a few Pride marches. And maybe there's a reason for that because, that's what we see in the media. That's what gets publicized. But don't forget that Prides happen in many different forms, in many different shapes and sizes. And I think that there is still absolutely a place for those kinds of Prides in our various communities.
Oh, this is a good question. Which LGBTI plus activist would you erect a statue for?
Look, that's a very difficult question. As you can see, I probably have a number of LGBTIQ heroes, but one person, and the person who I cited in my speech, who I just think is just a phenomenal thinker, organizer, activist, scholar, is Angela Davis. And she has been pioneering activism and scholarship around issues of social justice back in the 60s until now. So I think, she's someone who I hold with enormous admiration and respect and would be very happy to see a statue of her, though I'm sure she probably wouldn't say that. So,
We've talked for many years, Sen, about internalized homophobia within the LGBTQ community. What about externalized transphobia from within that community?
Oh, you mean within gay men? And is that
well,
what you mean?
I didn't want to put it as explicitly as that, but
well, no, I'm happy to, I'm happy to talk about that. I mean, I am a gay man, so I can talk about that. I mean, the point to make is that we all deal with internalized homophobia and transphobia and externalized transphobia to some extent. And it would, no one can claim that they're free of it. But I think it's really important for us, I often struggle when I meet sort of gay men who are very, hostile, if you like, towards trans people and trans children. And my response is always, when we were kids, they used to say, you're confused, you're being pressured, you're too young to know, you're going to regret your lifestyle. And it strikes me enormously odd that these men who have grown up hearing these statements think that they can now say exactly the same things about trans young people. We should know from our history that, when people diminish who we are, diminish our identities, say that they know better than us about who we are and where we come from, that's enormously hurtful. So it strikes me really odd that people still think that they can almost recycle homophobia now to attack trans people. And it saddens me.
Lots of parallels there, aren't they? The medicalization, the pathologization of people. Nothing new about that argument, is there?
No, nothing. No.
As a lawyer, where do you think the legal scholarship and the jurisprudence is likely to go? Where are the battles going to be? Where are the venues for those future battles on some of these issues?
Look, I think there are numerous battles that are ahead. I mean, we already see how contentious, the legal recognition of trans people are. But, we also know that intersex people are still largely invisibilized and erased in a lot of policy discussion. So ensuring, the forced interventions on intersex infants to quote unquote fix their bodies is prevented. That's something that we'll need to see some work on. We already know that a number of LGBT people who seek asylum, for example, in the UK are denied protection because, decision makers don't believe that they're really gay or really trans. So, there are a number of fronts that we're going to be fighting on. And I think, these issues of law and legal recognition are very important, but they're not the final issues. And I think we often, maybe put law too high on a pedestal, I think, when we also need to be recognizing that a lot of the work we still have to do is going to be social, it's going to be cultural, it's going to be religious and political and economic. And, those are much harder fights. Changing a law, as hard as it might be and as is often easier than, having the more difficult conversations to change society as a whole.
If you look at the history of LGBTQ people, different names, different language, even before Stonewall, you've got the Mattachine Society, you've got the Daughters of Bilitis, the homophile movement, homosexuality being a kind of pathological term, and you've got gay, and then LGBT, and Q, and queer, and on it goes. What do you think the state of play linguistically will be in 50 years' time?
Look, the thing about language is that it evolves and it changes. People use the acronym differently in different parts of the world. For example, in North America, they add two spirit to their acronym to recognize their First Nations Indigenous peoples. We already know that sexual and gender diversity exists across cultures and communities. It's not just a kind of a Western thing. And so I'm less concerned about this kind of, lettering and naming. If people want to use a particular acronym, I respect that. If people want to use a particular way to describe themselves, I will respect that too. I think so often we get caught up with language and we say, well, we need to have a definitive lettering system, or we need to have a definitive this. But at the end of the day, these sorts of questions are about context. It's where you are in the world, what time you are in the world, and who you're talking to. And it's going to change depending on those factors.
And maybe, is it possible there'll be a move beyond identity politics to a post identity description or no description, where people simply say, this is who I am, deal with it?
Yeah, I think unfortunately the term identity politics has kind of been battered in the media lately. And I think what we forget is actually, if you even to look at Stonewall, it wasn't a quote unquote identity politics movement. They weren't just talking about, gay people in that context. They were also talking about police violence. They were talking about military interventions. They were already talking about, broader issues. So actually, we've already been doing this work for a long time, and we're continuing to do this work. It's just unfortunate that sometimes the media and some people within our community often forget that history and forget that organising, and often say that we are too siloed or too identity-based, when really we're trying to speak beyond just ourselves to relate to other people and other communities who, to quote unquote, build a better world, as cliched as that might sound.
This question is prompted, I think, by your reference to Lyra McKee. What would you say to your younger self, Sen?
Do you know what? I was a very lucky younger self. From a young age, I had parents who completely enabled my queerness and my gender play and my lipstick wearing. And so what I would say to my younger self would be, just remember, you can become a professional gay when you grow up, and it will be fabulous.
Another question from Facebook. Do you think brands can authentically engage with LGBTQ rights versus merely tokenistic marketing campaigns?
Look, I think it's difficult to answer that in a general sense. I would always say that, when brands want to get involved, they often have good intentions. But at the same time, companies have their own agendas, and we need to be wary of that. We shouldn't become a kind of corporate movement, and brands shouldn't use LGBTI people to sell things. So at the end of the day, I always say that it needs to be meaningful. If you're a brand wanting to, get people, get behind Pride, for example, pay people to do work for you, and particularly pay groups and organizations and prides that are underrepresented. It's one thing to keep sending money and resources to the same 3 Pride events or the same 3 LGBTI organizations, when there are lots of local community organizations and community networks that could really use the support and resources. And I think that's a way that, companies can actually demonstrate authentic and meaningful engagement without, taking the front seat, if you like. I think, when it comes to brand engagement, brands definitely need to be behind the movement, not in front of it.
Here's another question from Facebook about gendered awards, whether it's the Oscars, the BAFTAs, the IFTAs, or whatever it is. Do you think that's still appropriate, or just as this person puts it, tone deaf and out of date?
Look, I've never really understood why they did, I guess maybe historically there were reasons for the differentiation of categories. I don't know nearly enough about that history to make a broader point, but I personally don't feel the need to have gendered categories of awards that deal with acting and theatricality and music. When you're judging aesthetic, artistic qualities, like we do in, we have other prizes in arts, for example, that aren't gendered. So I don't see why that would necessarily need to be any different in the entertainment industry.
What about gendered birth certificates? Gender on birth certificates?
You know what? I mean, I personally, think why do we collect that information on a birth certificate? Historically, various pieces of information were collected on birth certificate, like race, for example, which obviously is no longer recorded on a birth certificate. So, often we get caught up with, we need to add all these new categories to birth certificate, but then we might even just say, well, why do we even need to have a gender marker on a birth certificate? Is it necessary? I mean, even in, other forms of documentation, here in Sydney, for example, if you have a driver's license, there's no gender on that driver's license because and it has been that way for over 20 years. So it's not some LGBTI rights thing, but, we have to wonder and ask ourselves, why are we collecting this data in the first place? And if there's no need for it, then why should it be there?
I suppose you could ask the same question, and there has been a bit of news coverage of this about some of the meeting apps where racialized information is there as well for people. What was it doing there in the first place?
Yeah, look, I mean, there's a lot to be said about the politics of race and racism on dating apps and in the gay or LGBTIQ community more broadly. I think those sorts of filters and getting rid of those filters is an important step. But I think, unfortunately, we often focus on the symbolic steps and we say, oh, well, now we got rid of the race filter. Racism is gone from the app. And we all know that that's not true. And we know that racism is far more insidious than, people using filters. So I think, again, we also need to, reflect a little bit more about how we can address racism, in our communities and also in the spaces that we use, like dating apps, because unfortunately there is a lot of racism in those spaces and people do feel marginalized and excluded because of that.
Another one from Facebook here. What is the most pressing LGBT plus human rights issue for you personally right now?
Right. Okay. So, I mean, personally, I've been doing a lot of work around the legal recognition of trans people and trying to advocate a lot on that issue, primarily because for me, I've been particularly, I guess, personally affected by the fact that I see a lot of gay men in particular who are quite hostile to these issues, and they often use the same kinds of rhetoric that we had to endure when we were younger, homophobic rhetoric that I mentioned before. So I've been doing a lot of work on that front, but also an issue that I do a lot of work in because it's an issue that affects a lot of my friends, but also I have a personal background in this, is around migration. And particularly LGBT people who seek asylum, and supporting people and creating spaces for them to get safety is another really important issue for me.
Which country in the world, Sen, do you think has made the most strides and is in the best, at the moment, in the best place when it comes to LGBTQ rights?
That's a good question, but I always refuse to answer these sorts of questions. I don't like, when they do those sort of indexes where they're like ranking countries based on their LGBTI human rights records, because to me, it's just impossible. There are some parts of the world that will be doing better on on gay and lesbian rights, for example, but doing terribly on trans rights. Whereas you might have countries that are doing reasonably well on trans rights. I mean, for example, Pakistan has very progressive trans rights legislation and legal recognition of trans people. But of course, when it comes to issues relating to gay, lesbian, and bisexual people, not very good record. So, it varies and it's different. And I often find that these sorts of, where is the best country to be LGBT? I often find that they're really not helpful because it often focuses on a very specific kind of LGBT individual. And to be honest, it's usually a kind of white, middle-class, gay or lesbian person is your kind of index. And when you use that as your index, you're going to get a very different result to if you were dealing with, a trans sex worker from, a different part of the world, or a gay Christian person in another part of the world. So, it varies.
I know you've talked about Hinduism, you've talked about religion more generally as well. What's your response to someone within the queer community who is particularly negative about all religion, maybe sees all religion as a form of patriarchy or as a form of enslavement, and can't approach religion really in any kind of positive way in terms of building solidarity? What do you say to them?
Look, I know a lot of people who have been traumatized and victimized by people in their religious communities, whether they're pastors, temple leaders, if you like, and I have absolutely nothing but empathy and respect for them. And if they want to leave and completely disassociate themselves from that, that is, of course, their right and entitlement to do. I suppose my issue is more with people who don't really have any engagement, but often just say, oh, no, you can't be gay and religious, without fully understanding that for a lot of people, their religions have actually been sources of strength for them and have actually given them the space to define and cultivate who they are. For example, in Hinduism, there's a lot of gender diversity among the divinity. And so actually a lot of trans people, for example, often use the gods as representations of who they are. So they derive a lot of strength from that. And I think that's beautiful. And I think, we should be allowing people the space to claim their religious identities and not make them choose, because often what that does is just alienates people more.
A question here from Facebook about Eastern European countries, Eastern Europe more generally, and just inviting you to make some comments on what you think is going on there in some countries like Hungary. I think some people are mentioning Poland as well.
Look, it is unfortunate that what we're seeing is this broader kind of rise in authoritarianism, and it's deeply concerning. And what is particularly concerning is we're seeing this phrase gender ideology that's being utilized as a way to attack both women's rights and LGBT rights. So, these politics lend themselves to these sorts of conservative attitudes or to traditional gender roles, for example. So in a number of countries, we're seeing not only attacks on, trans people and intersex people, but also on access to abortion and reproductive health care more broadly. And I think it's really important, at a time where people are saying that, trans rights are opposed to women's rights, or LGBT rights go against the rights of, groups of women, for example. It's really important for us to say, well, actually, what we're seeing at the moment in these countries is a rise of authoritarian and kind of fascist political, groups that are effectively trying to weaponize this term gendered ideology in order to attack both women and LGBT people and communities. So what we need to do is come together in order to resist that. And I think it's really important right now to recognize that this isn't just about us as LGBT people, but it's also about people who are migrating, people who are seeking asylum, because we know that these countries are also militarizing their borders. And, the rise of racism and xenophobia is also deeply worrying. So I think we also need to recognize this broader kind of political move that is happening and resist it.
And just a final question from me, Sen. Obviously, we're meeting remotely, and that's because of the pandemic. There are two pandemics recognized by the World Health Organization in the world today. The other is HIV. We don't talk about HIV in the way that we talk about coronavirus often in the political conversation, but it's there, it's recognized. And people with HIV have struggled a great deal in our world and in our society, not just from society generally, but also from within their own communities.
Of course. This is the point about pandemics, is they reveal the nature of stigma and shame that run deep within our communities. And, it's so unfortunate that, words like dirty and clean are often used to associate, particularly with gay men, depending on their serous status, whether they're HIV or negative. And I think, we as a community really need to confront that. And I think things have improved significantly, particularly we know with PrEP and the, revolution in access to testing and safe sex more broadly. We've seen some of those stigmas change and dissipate, but unfortunately we still deal with a lot of shame and secrecy and stigma. And we see that not only in the context of HIV, but in terms of coronavirus. And as we all know, when you stigmatize communities and when you shame them, you make public health issues worse. And I think right now it's so important that we focus on solidarity and community and not policing and shaming people, because that's only going to intensify our problem.
Sen, it's been lovely talking to you. Thank you so much. We could talk all night.
I know.
Wonderful to see the embodiment. It felt like a bit of a fiver. I'm sorry, but so many questions. The embodiment of the possibility of being an intellectual and fiercely fabulous is Sen Raj. Thank you very much. And over.
Thank you so much.
Listen, thank you, Sen, and thank you, William. That was not only hugely informative, it was a really inspirational way to spend an hour. So thank you so much. I can't believe how much you got crammed into those 60 minutes, and a great reminder of not just the multi-dimensional lives we lead, but the multi-dimensional intersectional struggles we need to pursue in order to make the world better for everyone. Now, before we let you go, we want to ask you to do one thing. We want to highlight one of the many human rights defenders that Amnesty International works with, who we've been asking people to take action for during Pride Month, and tens of thousands of people already have done so. And this is for an activist in Poland called Elżbieta Podleśna. She is an incredible LGBT plus rights activist there. Like many others, though, she is facing the consequences for standing up for herself and for her community. And right now she's facing the possibility of 2 years behind bars. We don't want her to go there. We need her in the community standing up for others. We want you to take action. You can send a petition, or you can sign the petition, send an email to the Polish Prosecutor General via the Amnesty website. So I would ask you to go there. We'll post some links on our social media as well to make it easy for you. But please add your name, stand up for Elżbieta, and meanwhile, happy Belfast Pride, and look forward to seeing you, albeit virtually, at the big Belfast Pride Parade on Saturday, and look out for lots of other great events between now and then. Thank you and good night.